Hello everybody. So I usually don't make it all the way through this, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Small group, like probably have time for questions and whatnot. So who am I? My name's John Dunlap, work for Gotham Digital Science, do exploit development, reverse engineering, security research, penetration testing, a lot of code review. One of my specialties is working with like odd languages, like if you've ever had a COBOL or Fortran or a Pascal or any of that kind of code review, it's part of my job to go deep diving on the languages not many people know, get out of the Java, C# kind of zone. I'm also big into the European demo scene if anybody knows what that is. So I'm here to talk about jump-oriented programming. Now, some people here might be familiar with return-oriented programming, and jump-oriented programming is a variation on that might become important later on in the future of exploit development. Right now, it's not really a viable thing in a lot of ways, but we're moving the technology in the direction where it might be. In the next few years, return-oriented programming attacks might become dead, more or less, due to protections built into processors themselves and better operating systems development, all that stuff. Probably safe for the foreseeable future, but it's going to happen eventually. So jump-oriented programming is a new way of doing things. It was described in 2010 by a group at North Carolina State University, but to my knowledge, there's never been a successful jump-oriented programming attack. And I'll show you why, because jump-oriented programming is magnitudes more complex than return-oriented programming. All right. What we're going to talk about here is how we can start to port return-oriented programming tools into jump-oriented programming tools, and to start to expand what little support there is in the current return-oriented programming tools, and to sort of also port what little support there is into other architectures, other situations where it doesn't exist. And also to sort of port the state-of-the-art ROP generation tools to jump-oriented programming. So, for those of you who are not familiar, return-oriented programming is an exploit technique that's used to bypass digital execution prevention. Basically, you can't execute code that you've injected into the program, on the stack or the heap. You have to reuse code in the program using addresses and returning to them repeatedly to disable dep. Code from the text session point back to an attacker control stack, and then control flow node is returned by the ret instruction. This bypasses the current protections in operating systems. The only thing keeping attackers from doing this today is good address-based layout randomization. But if you can break that, you can ROP, you can get out, and you can exploit stuff, right? Currently, return-oriented programming is sort of like the state-of-the-art of exploit techniques, but in my opinion, it is eventually going to die. Jump-oriented programming is different. Okay, we're going to remove the dependency on stacks, heaps. We can use any kind of source of data. Instead of repeatedly returning to the stack, we're going to build a series of gadgets that are going to free us of that restriction. Instead of going back to the stack, we're going to jump back into a series of dispatch gadgets and just get rid of the stack. Why are we going to do this? We won't always have stack control. We don't always have stack control now. Eventually, there'll be protections like Intel Shadow Stack, which will basically make it much, much harder to exploit things on the stack. Stack pivots are hard to find, much harder to find. With the prevalence of 64-bit operating systems, become progressively impossible. Things like heap spray exploits are going to become progressively impossible. If we're talking kernel space, stack pivots are dangerous. There might be important things that can crash an operating system on the stack. And when jump-oriented programming works, it has the potential to be far more convenient and stealthy for the attacker than the current method. So let's talk about practically what that entails. So here is sort of the model for a jump-oriented programming exploit as it was described in the original paper. What we have is a dispatch table, right? And then a gadget to iterate over that table. And that gadget can exist anywhere, right? And that will iterate us over a series of sort of functional gadgets, right? So this could be anywhere on attacker writable memory. It's not bound to the stack in any way. We can have completely stack-free exploit using this technique, but it does add some dependencies that weren't there with return-oriented programming attacks. In a lot of ways, the functional gadgets are the same, but instead of returning, we're jumping back into our dispatch table. So we're going to do a thing, jump into our iterator, and our iterator is going to put us back into the dispatch table, right? So we really need sort of three things, right? Functional gadgets with certain constraints on the registers, a dispatch gadget, again, with different constraints on those registers. These can't be the same, right? EBX, EDI, EDX. This has to be a dedicated thing to hold our program counter, although we could swap it around. It greatly increases complexity. And we need a place to put our gadgets. But in the case where a piece of software where we control different kinds of memory than stack or the heap, then this could be very convenient. We got to work, right? And the problem is that there isn't a good way to make it work right now. So let's talk about the various parts. First, we got the dispatcher gadget, which is meant to provide control flow. It needs to iterate over the program. But since we're sort of defining our own iteration, unlike with return-oriented programming where we're always iterating over the stack, return, 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 we can use different sort of data structures, right? Depending on what kind of iterator gadget we have, we could skip forward or backward in memory or use something more like a linked list, right? As long as our software is smart enough to help us find this or willing to dedicate enough time to do it by hand, then this could be extremely convenient, especially if we control the layout of memory in the program in a weird way. It could also be stealthy since our gadgets could be stored non-contiguously with each other, and we can also periodically change up how the gadgets are organized. Did I see a question back there? No? Okay, cool. However, we do need to control the value of a register. The ideal, simple way to do this is just to find an adder. Any pattern will do, and the original paper for this described various schemes involving linked lists. The tool I developed, I'll show you, has come up with various complicated data structures that you could use. And again, you can switch it up mid-attack if it suits you. You could also pull your instructions easily from two data sources or intermingle them or obscure them. You ultimately have a lot more control if you're willing to weather the complexity. All right? Functional gadgets are a little easier. Just has to do something and then jump back into our iterator/dispatcher gadgets. All right? It's a little easier to deal with, easier to find using the automated tools. And if you're familiar with return-oriented programming, the gadget flavors are the same, right? Ultimately, what we want to do is set up a call of some sort to turn off dep so that we can go about doing a much easier exploit, right? We don't want to be doing jump-oriented programming all day. What we want to do is do jump-oriented programming just long enough to turn off all the security inside the program and make it a lot easier for us to exploit, right? Because this is going to be involved, getting this done. Usually what that amounts to in Windows is setting up the arguments for virtual protect, which ultimately involves controlling all the registers. So a good wish list for this kind of exploit is to be able to control all registers. And here are the current tools, and I'm just going to say straight ahead, all of them are sort of lacking for this in various ways, and I've been going about modifying them and making alternative versions, add-ons, and whatnot for a little while now in order to better facilitate this kind of attack. We got ROP Gadget, Monad Pi, ROPC, Ropper, and Radare too. Generally what these things do is they just list jump instructions or unconditional jumps in whatever architecture you're asking them to analyze. However, if you listen to what I said before about the various kinds of gadgets, this could be a very daunting task to put together. And the other thing to keep in mind is that even large programs don't have that many unconditional jumps. So it's very important, compared to other instructions, right? So it's very important to be able to analyze and classify and rule out what you can and can't do. It's not like return-oriented programming where nearly every gadget is sort of viable for some purpose. It's important to classify them. None of the tools help you do that. The other thing to consider is architecture support. This is like a very useful technique on a variety of architectures, including some of the embedded architectures like AVR, ARM, that kind of thing. And of course, those are the least supported things. So here is a list of architecture support. All right. And it kind of jumps off away once you get past x86. It's kind of hard to find stuff, and even 64-bit is kind of not supported in general, which kind of sucks. Again, we're coming to a 64-bit world. Again, the support is basically you dump out a bunch of jump instructions and have fun putting together all the pieces and figuring out all the various dependencies. So Radare has very generic route functionality. In a way, Radare is sort of the best of the bunch in the sense that you can just ask it for whatever you want, right? It has very good search functionality, so you can say, this list of gadgets, can you find something that looks like this? But again, that throws a lot of the responsibility on the exploit developer and leaves you spending hours, days, weeks sifting through various side effect-laden gadgets. It's really not a good way to live. Again, just reiterating, all we're getting here is a list of gadgets, and no way to vet them, which is really what we want. So here's just an example of the kind of functionality provided by Radare. I'm sorry if it's hard to read, but again, it's just dumping out some jump instructions. Something to keep in mind if you want to do jump-oriented programming is that using larger binaries is to your advantage a great deal. This is not going to work out on a smaller binary. When we look at the tool I'm developing a little later, the test case I always use is libObjectiveC on macOS because it's big and has a lot of stuff going on. Running this against even medium-sized programs, native code, you're not going to find what you need. Here's more Radare on an even bigger binary still, in much larger binary, and we found some stuff. This isn't due to flaws in programs, it's just like lack of jump instructions in general, right? There's not that many conditional jumps compared to other instructions, and they don't always do what you need, and a lot of them have side effects. Let's look at another tool. This is Gadget. Again, similar list of stuff. Again, only unconditional jumps, right? And not a whole ton of them, and no information about what does Gadget do, how it's going to help you, and which of them goes in which part of the jump-oriented programming equation, right? More Gadget. And then MonoDPI also supports jump-oriented programming to some degree. Again, similar kind of support. Doesn't really help you put together the pieces. Although it is nice, MonoDPI, if you haven't used it, you should use it for your exploit development if you're working on x86. It doesn't support x64 at all, but it's very convenient. It's a single library. It works with a couple of debuggers, and it's generally wonderful. So, again, lack of gadgets. They take a long time to run, and it's not actually helping us the way we want it to. So what we'd like to do is improve the basic gadget search. What we want is more opcodes. We want a sort of vetting system for the opcodes, for the gadgets, and maybe find a way to use other types of jumps. Maybe there's other instructions that are equivalent to a jump. Maybe there's sequences of instructions that can be used in our jump-oriented programming attack. Maybe we can use conditional jumps. Maybe we can use the call instruction, I found out when I went through these tools, many of them didn't even support indirect jumps, like a jump to a pointer and that kind of thing. So That's something I'm going through and adding to all these tools. And then here's a list of improvements made to the tool. X64 registers, bear support for indirect jumps. Basically the same thing for Gadget. I would have loved to improve Monad.py, but the main thing I would improve is to add the x64 support, which is a massive year-long project. So what I did do was do a lot of work towards improving gadget comprehension. So what we want to be able to do is take those parts of the jump-oriented programming equation and classify the gadgets into those roles, and then make some kind of judgment about how fit they are for the role and what kind of side effects they provide. There's a couple of approaches to doing that, right? It's a lot of these tools give you some leeway as to how many instructions you read ahead of the, because obviously you need your gadget to do something before the return, right? So it's sort of a calibration how much you put ahead. Again, we're not reading into what kind of side effects it has. None of them help you put together these sort of data structures. So basic way they're doing this is grepping over binaries, looking for certain opcodes or mnemonics. What we're going to do is use a VM and then just actually run the gadgets and get some kind of real sense of what they actually do, and that'll give us a better sense of whether we can use them. All right, and then we're going to consider using conditional jumps. There are far more conditional jumps in a binary than there are non-conditional jumps, and none of the tools search for them, and there's good reason for that. Because conditional jumps in x86 are always relative, right? You're never going to jump to a register like we need, but we're still leaving out a very high potential for our jump-oriented programming to our control flow hijacking process. So one of my requirements for my own tool was to find a way to vet these conditional jumps and see if there wasn't a way to force them into use so we could have greater surface area of attack. Because one of the when people talk about why this attack might be impossible, the reason that keeps coming up is that there's just not enough jumps in a program as opposed to returns. Let's see. We're also going to see what we can do to force more functionality of our gadgets by messing with the registers and sort of fuzzing at them. All right. So just to give you an example of how conditional jumps end up working on x86. So if you see, we have this jump not equal here, and it's just used to jump over a piece of code, right? It doesn't jump to any arbitrarily controllable place. But what if by some sequence of events it did? That's what we're kind of looking for. None of them trivially will, but if you follow the chain out far enough, some of them do, and they can be part of the attack. So what we're going to do is take these conditional jumps along with the regular ones and sort of fuzz at them by mutating registers, and particularly fuzzing the flags register, trying all the iterations of the flags register to see if we can't get some kind of return-oriented programming related functionality out of it. So this is where we're going to see the first screenshot from my tool, and it's called Unidiff. And what it does is it uses the Unicorn emulator and takes the output of a modified version of Gadget and runs various jump-oriented programming gadgets and gives some idea of their functionality. I'm going to go over a little bit of what that output means in a second, but that's how some of the output looks. Okay, so what if we want to find a dispatch table or our sort of iterator gadget? We need to find gadgets that do a couple things. Modify a register and jump to a predictable location. So my tool finds gadgets that do that and rates them based on how user controllable they are and what kind of side effects they have. This is a step closer to having a fully automated tool that'll put together the chain for you. And it's going to say demo. We're not quite to the demo. So here's what table traversal looks like from a control flow perspective, or this is really our requirements, right? We want a user controllable register and a mutatable value and a jump to our user controllable register. So here's some clear output from my tool, and what this is giving you is an address of Gadget followed by hex for the instructions, and then followed by a user controllable register, and how much it's been changed by mutation. So what this is telling you is that if you put in your user controllable EEX, you're going to get back the same number plus 70, right? And so what you can do is make your jump table, and it's got to be a data structure where each of your malicious instructions is separated by 70 bytes. We'll see later my tool finds a lot more options for that. You can even see below it found somewhere they were negative 438 bytes apart from each other, right? There's a lot of possibilities, but the fact that the tool vets them speeds up the process tremendously. Let's look at some functional gadgets. What we need to do here is a little easier, right? So we need to mutate a controlled register, but not the register that we just selected to be our program counter, right? We also want to just try not to destroy any other registers. Keep in mind that the ultimate goal here is to set up all the registers for a virtual protect call. That would be the nicest thing, and then we want to jump back into the table. So ultimately it would be great if we could control some kind of register we like to. So here's an example of a compatible gadget that my tool found. Now, once you've identified some gadgets like my tool has, now you need to find a way to put them together. And again, even with the help I just provided, it's a very long, tedious, trouble-fraught process. And so I went and sort of reverse engineered the various ROP tools to see how it was done for them. Generally not super great, right? But everybody's working to get better and better stuff. So Corlin's tool, Mono.py, has a great algorithm for building ROP chains. And it does this by sort of backwards tracing. It takes a sort of a final ending point and tries to go over past in the program and work back to an input, right? The problem with that is that it's extremely computationally expensive. It takes a long time to run, and even for relatively trivial ROP payloads, it might not ever finish or might not give you a good answer. So I decided not to go that way. Here's a little snippet of the related code. The direction I'm going, and I don't have a demo for it right now, is I'm building an SMT solver to automatically find, sort of permutate and select combinations of these gadgets. One of the good things about my tool, as I'll show you in a moment, is that it shows you which gadgets don't provide side effects. And once you have that list of which gadgets don't provide side effects, you can start simplifying your processor model. If you know that you can get through your execution to a certain point without modifying this or that register, you can simplify, and that's very amenable to the SMT solver technique. Problem is you have to create a model, and it's a time-consuming process. So that's what we're working on now. There's already someone, his name's Coke Joe. I think he's in Europe. He's already done a similar thing with return-oriented programming, and the problem he's going through, with a much simpler, we're calling return-oriented programming simple here, with a much simpler process, is that, again, it is very computationally expensive and might not ever finish in real programs. So that's really a struggle right now, is to try and simplify this for the SMT solver so it does eventually finish satisfiable. What else have we been doing to improve this? Adding architecture support. So everything I've just talked about, I am adding support for ARM, AVR, ZOS, Spark, And we're just going to go over some of the existing support for the job-oriented techniques and the amenability of the technique to the various architectures. Generally, of the not x86 type architectures, ARM is the best supported, but not supported very well. None of the tools take into account any of the eccentricities of branching the ARM platform. If anyone's read any ARM assembly, you know that you can't just do certain things. You have to take thumb mode into account, prefetch instructions and whatnot. It's not as simple as using a list of gadgets. Again, the tool does not help you do that. I am working on a tool that will help you do that, so that you don't have to think so hard about exactly how the processor model works when you're putting it together your chain. I would very much like to see AVR support, and people often ask me why I'm so concerned with that. Part of that is that I started my career in technology and 3D printing. Spent a lot of time working on very improvised electronics, including a lot of Arduinos and little prototyping boards. And just this year at DEF CON, I gave a talk on hacking 3D printers, taking advantage of them to do horrible, malicious things with 3D printers. And the topic of doing return-oriented programming in AVR kept coming up again and again and again. Part of the reason for that is that because AVR is a Harvard architecture, return-oriented programming is the only way to do exploitation. It's protected. The memory and instructions are separated from each other from the very start. So jump-oriented programming is actually extremely amenable to AVR processors. There's not a single tool that supports this, and unfortunately, the dearth of quality AVR simulators, or I should say, open source, high quality AVR simulators, has been an impediment. In fact, we're just going to skip over this slide where I cast some shade on the current AVR disassembler frameworks. We're just going to leave that by. And then I did some Spark. And again, being closer to the RISC architectures, while not being a super practical field, it's an interesting one to add this functionality to. Because, frankly, all these tools provide Spark support, or a lot of them do, Spark support for x86, so why not add it for jump-oriented programming, which I did. So here's an example of a Spark encoding, in case you ever wondered or were curious about doing that and putting that together. And here's an overview. I found some points of improvement in common jump tools, added architecture support to several of them. I'm developing a tool to make the technique a lot easier, and getting closer and closer every day to a point where it will be totally automated. At the start of this project, I thought that this technique would be mostly impossible, since it's, again, almost never seen in the wild, but I found it's quite feasible from what I've seen in my own experiments. I plan on adding more architectures, integrating concolic execution techniques, and then start providing known payloads for existing libraries. I think that's really the end goal of this, is to have some common payloads just like there exists for ROP, so that people can play around with it. So that's the end of the presentation, as it were, and now it's time for a little bit of a demo. All right. So here's some sample output, but before we do that, we are going to take a look at a list of gadgets given out by ROPers. So one of the changes I made to, or ROP gadget I should say, one of the changes I made to it was to modify it so, oh geez, can't type while I talk. There we go. Modify it so it would give non-conditional jumps as well. So in this example here, I've limited just to instructions with a jump greater or equal in them somewhere, or a jump greater, I should say. That was impossible before. This gives you a little bit of the idea of the input from my program, is it takes a list of these gadgets where we have an address, disassembly isn't used, and then we have hex encoding of the instructions themselves. That's what my tool used. And then we're going to give a quick example of my tool running. And this is it going over looking for interesting gadgets in a list of gadgets. What it's doing is going one by one and running them, and then sort of fuzzing them with inputs and trying to figure out what changes, what doesn't, and what can be controlled by the user. So this is the final list of interesting gadgets, and I'll help you take a look over it real quick. We'll sort of scoot up to the top. This is good enough. So we have an address, hex encoding to be used later if necessary, and then a rating, 1 to 3, with 1 being the best, 2 indicating some kind of controllable change, and 3 some kind of controllable change but in the negative direction. So we can see we have one where we control a register. It should say which, it doesn't. Bug. But it will also tell us which registers are invariant and haven't been changed by the process. So in this case we see that EEX is invariant, EDX is invariant, but ECX is changed by -858. So if we needed a subtractor gadget, we could do it, but we have to move in increments of 858, which isn't necessarily the most useful, but here we have -2. That's a little more useful. That's basically the gist of what it does. There's some other features. This is still under development and being put together. All right. Well, that's about the end of what I have to say. We've got plenty of time here, so I'm willing to take some questions if people are curious. Currently I'm just using Z3, but I should, yeah, definitely, right? Yeah, that's a great idea. That would definitely save me some work putting together a processor model. Sure. Oh, legally. They're expensive. You have to buy them from IBM. Well, not the emulator. So you can get an open source emulator. There's a Hercules emulator. What costs so much money is the actual operating system, the how do you say, the disk image. If you look around, they are online, but since I do this research publicly, I try not to pirate anything.